This is Enneagram Invitations, saying yes to transformation. I'm Karen Burley, a multi-certified Enneagram teacher, somatic facilitator, and transformationalist. Join me and other seasoned Enneagram students as we explore how the Enneagram invites us to wake up and transform, personally and collectively. We are delving into the highs, lows, and everything in between on the journey inward. Leave feeling inspired to recognize the invitations you're receiving, and, when the time is right, the courage to say yes. Here we go. Ooh, okay, back with another episode. Those of you listening in real time will know that this episode's coming a few weeks after the last one. I have been deep in training, doing somatic Enneagram work in person in really wonderful ways. And I've also been flexing my muscle of letting myself not be on a rigid schedule, which is a fun theme for this conversation with a type 1 who we may know can get rigid and have a lot of structure. Actually, my conversation that you're about to hear with Andrew Lang is a really beautiful look at how that doesn't have to take over the life, even of a type 1. And I'm feeling that in myself. So I'm really excited to share this episode with you. It was actually the first conversation that I recorded for this podcast. And keeping in the theme of sacred flow, what I'm calling this episode, and you'll hear us really touch on that in this, it feels so timely to share it now. I am just really touched listening back to this at how in his heart space Andrew was in this conversation and is as a person that I know. He's been such a gift to me as a friend and colleague, and we kind of have met over the internet but grew up not far away from each other and have just had a really beautiful connections over these last few years since I've known him. And you'll get to hear him talk about some of the grief work that he does with people and how accessing his silliness and learning to be less rigid in his body in particular has opened up a lot more flow. And you will hear how he's super passionate about taking action within community. And that's something that feels so important right now politically. And if you're listening in the future, I'm sure it will still feel relevant. So I'm really excited that Andrew is offering you, Enneagram Invitations listeners, a free resource. You can pay for it on his website, but he's offering it to us for free. And it's his Gentle Change Starter Kit for busy people, a step-by-step guide to engaging in activism in a way that feels grounded, clear, and just right for you. It's about you as a busy person being able to do something politically active, taking action without burning out. So you can grab that for free at practice.andrewglang.com/starter-kit. And that link is in the show notes, so make sure you head to those if you want that free guide. And one more thing to plug up top here, speaking of grief and the heart, I am launching my latest Enneagram cohort, calling it the Enneagram Heart Work Cohort. And it really is looking at how we protect ourselves from truly feeling the grief that we carry around in our own hearts and doing it together in community, being witnessed, being aware of ourselves and the attunement we're longing for that maybe we didn't get when we were younger or when we were going through something that activated some of the grief that we carry. And it's really looking at the heart center through the lens of all 9 types and together. And then I bring in somatic practices so that we can be really skillful on not overwhelming our nervous system, because the heart is one of the most tender organs in our bodies, and like psychologically, emotionally, somatically, we want to be really gentle with this type of work. It's not just about release or crying or anything like that. It really is a complex and interesting exploration that I'm going to be doing with people in community. And I recently did a free workshop on how we have developed coping mechanisms to protect ourselves from our deepest grief. and how we keep using them even when we are more ready to process those things. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to get you that recording. You can always head to karenbriley.com/links for more information on this one, or in the future groups that I run will also link back there. And if you want to do more one-on-one work around this stuff, this is the type of work that I do with people, is navigating some really difficult, deeply held things through the lens of the Enneagram and somatic work so that we're tending to our nervous systems while we uncover what's in our shadows. So that is what I have to plug. Going back to Andrew and our conversation, he'll introduce himself a bit, but a little bit more about him. Andrew Lang is an educator in the Pacific Northwest and serves as lead facilitator of the Gentle Change Collective. He writes a weekly newsletter sharing frameworks and practices that help folks take meaningful action in gentle and sustainable ways. And within the Gentle Change Collective, it's really for folks who are overwhelmed by what's happening in our world and in their communities and want support feeling emboldened to take their first step, to stick with their change work, to share how things are going in community, and to be sustained through practices of resilience that help you embody healing and repair in community. You can find his work and offerings at andrewglang.com. That link is also in the show notes, along with that Gentle Change starter kit. And he didn't tell me to say this, and we didn't get to talk about it in our conversation, but I can't help but share with you that Andrew also wrote a book, and it's called Unmasking the Inner Critic: Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. I have a copy, and I will say it is such a sweet companion to your inner journey. It's filled with personal stories, contemplative wisdom, and embodiment practices. And you can just really feel how deeply Andrew has gone with his own work, how much he has gleaned from mentors and teachers near and far. So I am excited to share some of his wisdom here with you. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Andrew Lang. So welcome to Enneagram Invitations, saying yes to transformation. So good to have you here, Andrew. And I want you to introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners.
Yeah, it's so good to be here. I'm excited for the conversation. I've been a teacher working in the education space for the last 7 or 8 years. I was teaching for a while. Now I work as a trainer of teachers, doing a lot of professional development type stuff. But my true love is working with adults and kind of unpacking, what were the dreams that you had when you were young that maybe didn't happen, and how are you processing that now? And so it's a lot of story work, a lot of unlayering, uh, and it's a lot of, in its own way, grief work and also joy work, right? Like celebrating who you are while also holding who you dream to be at one point. So a lot of really fun stuff, heavy stuff. And that's, I think, also goes hand in hand with my ongoing personal use of the Enneagram in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, grief was the word that came to mind when you said,
Yeah.
what did you dream yourself to be and how are you
Yeah.
processing that? Ooh,
Yeah.
which is amazing for, in Enneagram 1, I see so much of the work is getting into that heart space. I wanted to ask, if there was a way for you to introduce your personality and then also introduce your essential nature kind of as you see it today.
Ooh, wow. Okay, so I'm gonna spitball some of the words that just came to my mind immediately. My personality is silly goofball, dancing, humming, whistling, while also pointing a finger and saying, "What are the things that need to shift so that everyone else can dance and sing and play exactly like me?" That is, I think that's in so many ways what my unintentional personality. I'm not focusing and doing some of my inner work. I think that silliness can get it feels so free and awesome, and then it can shift. And I can look out into the world and notice all the gaps. Notice, these are the things that are wrong. These are the injustices. And how can I bring my energy into that to get other people dancing? I think that's part of my personality. I think the essence that's underneath that is the 3-year-old version of me that used to run around the house naked. I think that's like the silliness and the dancing, and I grew up in a household that my parents both did work that was very serious, and yet also when they were home, had no issue, like, getting on the carpet with my brother and I and playing and having so much fun. So I've always had this kind of both and really hard conversations happen, as well as we can have fun with it, and I think that is where my personality as a teacher was the strongest when I was in the classroom, is that I could be that jovial Mr. Lang, as well as the person who was gonna be like, "Yeah, and we also need to, like, do these things."
Wow. Yeah, the both and is so much of the spiritual work, I feel, and so for you to have been introduced to that so young and to hold on to it lightly, as it is, like, we can't grasp for it or else we get into trouble. But that's amazing because in the body center in particular, we talk about anger and fight, and actually the natural resolution to the fight response is play. So for
Yeah.
you to have had that, and it sounds like it's kind of been a through line in your life, is just so beautiful to hear.
And it's constant. So I'll share a story. A few months ago, I was out with a friend, and my friend likes to go to this park that's near my house, and he just walks through. It's part of his personal practice, walking amongst the trees and the nature. He does poetry, and so I think he's sitting with that nature in a very open and curious way, and that later comes out in his poetry. But he invited me over, and he said, "Do you want to go for a ramble?" And I immediately was like, "What in the world is a ramble in this context?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. Let's just go." And we started walking the trail of this park that's connected to this beach. And next thing I know, he's taking a hard left turn and basically climbing down the cliff to the beach from an upper trail. And I look at him and I just say, "But it's the trail. We walk the trail, right? Like this is the rule." And he said, "Come on." And so we have just the most fun time climbing down this cliffside. And we get to the bottom and we're walking along the beach. And I realized that what had just happened was actually a foreshadowing of what was about to happen. Because we're walking along this rocky beach and he veers off and he starts walking on some logs. And, the fun walking, right? Where you have one foot in front of the other, you've got 2 arms out, you're trying to balance on it, and everything in my body is going, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm playing." And that was a big moment for me of realizing you're never too old to play, that my body has been so desensitized, so that my silliness has been trained to come out through my voice and my singing and my whistling, but the actual act of physically in an embodied way going and playing that isn't, on a basketball court or something, right? Like, was totally a change for me. So watching him just, like, happily get on some logs was like this big invitation to me of just like, "Hey, you can continue to play because that's something that unlocks your essence."
And it's unstructured play.
Yeah,
It's just play on some logs. And, we see kids, they'll play with sticks in the dirt. It's not that they need this specific game or structure. But
yeah.
when we get older, it's like, well, I can play for an hour at my basketball game or whatever structure. So what happened in your body, like that allowed you to get into that playful space, or what did you notice?
In the moment, I think the invitation went straight to my brain, and I processed it intellectually. And then later that day, I realized like, "Oh, that was an invitation for my body. That was a modeling," right? Someone was modeling for me the invitation that has always been present with me. And later on, I think I now do it almost every time I go to the beach, but it was basically like, maybe I can dabble. Maybe maybe I can put one leg on the on the log, right? Or like, "Hey, let me take 3 seconds to hop over here and then hop back." So I think it's almost like flexing a muscle or working a muscle a little bit. I didn't do anything in the moment. It was totally a processing and then later being like, "I can intentionally try this."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so let's back up because I think when we have those moments that we're actually able to reflect on, it's often because we have a decent amount of self awareness. Like, oh, I know I'm predisposed to not bodily allow myself to play. I'm curious, how did the Enneagram first make its invitation to you? Like, what was your story of finding your type? And when did you first say yes to it that you can recall?
So there was some fits and starts. I stumbled upon the Enneagram when I was 19 or 20, so early college, and it was a party trick, right? That's how I took it. It was introduced to me as this fun thing you can do, take this test, and I have always had a personality, if something strikes me and I can feel it beyond my brain. If it's, if something slips past my ego and speaks to me at a deeper level, I can't let it go easily. And so I took this test and I went, oh, intriguing. And then I picked up a book and then I picked up three and then five. And then I listened to every podcast I could. Right. And what it really spoke to in me was, um, it was a system. It was a system of someone else mirroring back to me in a way my experiences. So it immediately was like, "Oh, you're not alone." And I wouldn't say that that's, what ever been my core fear, but I do think that when I'm in unhealth, what will frequently happen is I will feel like I'm the only one seeing the issue, or I'm the only one seeing what needs to be done, or I'm the only one in the room, right? So it's not a feeling of loneliness of being, it's a feeling of loneliness of, are you watching what I'm watching? And so I picked up a bunch of books, and then what really I think one of my first books I read was Richard Rohr's book on the Enneagram, and then when I was at the Living School, he didn't directly teach it, but he mentioned it, again and again and again, and by that point, it was very much like reaffirming this system that I'd been working with, and so it just kind of kept operating in me. And what I love about the Enneagram in my life, how I've used it, is that I've always seen it as a toolkit. I've always seen it as this way and this language of understanding my experience or noticing, like, oh, that's why that flag just went up, or oh, that's why that thing just happened within me.
Yeah, you're really speaking to this invitation to having a direct experience of ourselves. And so often we get hung up on the labels or the terms or whatever. But when you said, I've always had to follow when something gets past my ego, my barriers, and like that direct experience, especially as someone who kind of is at home in the body center, I don't think we get taught it, but when you feel it, it's so hard to ignore.
Yeah. Well, and I'll share another story. This was just a couple of years ago. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. Um, but I was sitting on a couch and I was just processing and I was thinking through the lens of the Enneagram, and I was really doing work with, what's my core fear? What childhood wound do I have? Like, how did I become a one? Was that something I was born with? Like, did something happen to me? Like, I was asking all these questions. And it was a absolute breakthrough moment for me when I realized, because I'd read so much that ones live in spaces that are often unorganized. And I was like, that doesn't fit. And I didn't grow up in a highly systematized household. So it didn't quite fit. And then it was a breakthrough moment when I started thinking about my dad. And I started thinking about uh, the ways in which I have always put him up on a pedestal of the good, the right. And I think a lot of that invited oneness in me, just that kind of one personality, that one essence to show up. When I think about myself when I was really young, I feel like a lot of the seven, you would have looked at me and been like, that's a lot of seven. Like, it's a lot of just like bouncy, happy, go. And I sometimes wonder if in the soul child theory, some wounding happened and the one was my defense mechanism. I know Chichi talks about like goodness as armor. And I totally like that connects so much. Like, how can I use my goodness to protect myself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love this whole child theory where there's a tension between that 7 and that 1. And for whatever reason, the 1 is the safety mechanism, right?
Hmm.
And so there's a way of saying, well, I can only be that 7 thing, like, if everything else is totally taken care of.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I need this goodness as armor. Were you aware, like, from early on that you needed
to know who to follow or what was good or how to be okay in that kind of way?
So when I was a kid, I was always looking for mentors. Um, I maybe my leading 2 questions by the time I graduated high school was, what does it mean to have a spirituality? Because I felt like there was something, but what I was offered was not it for me. And I think my second question was, what does it mean to be a man? And so both of those questions really, uh, I think those flavored the mentors I reached out to and the mentors I kind of went towards. And yeah, I think I've always had a feeling of I need someone else to be there,
Mm.
to be there for me, but also just like to check me. I think I've always been aware of my tendency to see problem and jump into action, sometimes in an unhealthy way. I mean, it's the fixer, the doer, right? Like in a lot of ways, that's what I was trained up into. And not just by, my family, but by culture, by society, right? Like as a man, that has been a huge message is that it is my job to duct tape the world. And especially as a white man, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of my work has been how can I find mentors and other folks who will check me on that tendency. So if they can see it in me, they can help me start to see it in me and be able to work with it and process it.
It's so fascinating because I hear from one so often that they feel the conviction that that is their job and that they do have that skill. So they should just keep going and keep going and keep going. And yet I'm hearing in you, and maybe because there was kind of that softness around play and like these supports that you had in your life, that you were also kind of aware of the dangers of it. And so many people I talked to in the Enneagram space, like, had a moment where it had to be like something wasn't working. And that's when I found that I was getting tripped up by my ego. And what I'm hearing from you, and I feel kind of similarly, and we're near a similar age and maybe had some similar values growing up, but you kind of checked yourself. You were kind of like, hold on a second. I need some give and take because obviously I can't know everything, or I don't, there's this I'm fascinated by ones because I don't think the literature captures it. Because there's a way of saying, like, I have to be right and I am right, but there's also this internal struggle of, what if I'm really messing something up, but then I don't wanna let anyone see that part of me?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the part of ones as at least in my experience, that is so interesting is that what you see on the outside, you can make assumptions about what's happening on the inside, right? And I think a lot of the Enneagram literature does. I think there's a lot of, the statements like, the critical nature you see on the outside, they're being double critical to themselves on the inside. And that's true, at least to my experience in some ways. Uh, and there's also like when you have that inner gaze, there's questions. I think this is sometimes lumped into like the health, unhealth kind of duality. But there's aspects of when you have that inner gaze and you begin to look inward and you are critical, there's a lot of growth that is then possible. So I know for me, a lot of my ability to be self aware, some of that comes from the people I've been around, some of that comes from my upbringing. And a lot of that comes from I felt off in high school and early college. I moved towards friends groups that never fit. And so I always had this question of where is my fit? And inwardly, that led to questions of, well, who the hell are you? And so there's a lot of possibility in that question of who are you? And so I think that's the oneness for me was not necessarily looking in and being like, where's all the problems I've got to fix in me? It was an inward gaze of like, I know there's going to be some gaps. I know there's going to be some like things that aren't quite right because I feel it out here in the real world. And so where are those spots and who are the wisdom teachers around me and through history that can help me like sit with those gaps or sit with.
Yeah, love hearing you talk because it's to me, I'm imagining, like, the irritation that is so inescapable from the one's perspective of when the environment isn't matching the internal
Mhm.
needs and standards. But then you had this way of not taking that with a critical lens, but this questioning lens, and you mentioned, like, that has the energy of possibility versus criticism, like, everything's wrong. There must be something wrong. Now I have to fix it, which is where the ego jumps in to act quickly in reactivity and defensiveness. But something about, your way of being was able to inquire and question instead of just be critical.
Yeah, and I don't know, there's parts of me, the word that comes to my mind is weaponization. I think culturally, many of us, and you watch most TV, but like culturally, many of us are taught to weaponize personalities, right? And to weaponize aspects of personalities. And so at somehow in my upbringing, I can weaponize many things against myself, right? That's a reality. But somewhere in there, I got taught something countercultural that was that you can also hold yourself gently. And I am so thankful for almost certainly my mom. I'm so thankful that energy was given to me so that it could sit with that critical ability to critique and form a little dance.
I just got whole body chills. Oh, the softening. I mean, this is what we talk about as we're always going to have the type structure, but can we loosen it? Can we let it happen when needed for survival, but not let it happen so often that we get caught up in it and can't thrive and can't be anything outside of it?
Yeah, so I'll share one of my core practices that I do, and this started almost directly from working with the Enneagram. And it was the first time I realized that my shoulders hunch up and like get super tight when I either feel like my goodness is being challenged or that I'm out of control, which are usually two of the same things. And so a lot of my personal work in like relaxing the structure, allowing myself to be more than my type, right? Like those kind of things. A lot of that came through the body for me of like, if I can be aware of my shoulders tensing up and then let them drop and take a breath, then the unhealthiest aspects of me can chill, right? And I can allow the more gentle aspects of me to show up. And it's almost like allowing myself, my inner critic, whatever you want to call that, it's almost like allowing that part of me to stand down.
Mm.
And that's been a big practice for me. It's just like I sometimes refer to it as working from the outside in, but like using your body as the flag that there needs to be some sort of gentling or softening somewhere in you.
Oh, I love that so much. And you said you kind of came across this when you had the structure, you started noticing, oh, this is a practice that is like directly correlated.
Oh yeah, it was direct. I mean, it was there's so many stories. I mean, I now I do it almost every day where I'll just realize, and I think that's the power of the Enneagram as a tool, right? And as a toolkit, which is often the way I work with it, is that it's not that I'm constantly going through life thinking Enneagram, Enneagram, Enneagram. I'm going through life knowing that my body will often show me flags that point to things that like the Enneagram helps give language for.
Yeah. Had you come across this more somatic or body based understanding before that? Or how did the Enneagram help? Like we talked about these three centers of intelligence, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. As with most, this is just kind of how my last decade or so has worked. But as with most things, I had a body experience of something, didn't have words for it, but it felt right. And so I rolled with it and then later realized, oh, there's words for this. So the first one for me was I grew up in a faith setting. And when I really looked at that faith setting and said, this religious tradition doesn't work for me, I sat down with my brother and I said, what do I really feel drawn to? I feel drawn to silence and candles and, one line of wisdom and just like sitting with that line. What I was really talking about was contemplation. Right? But I had no word for that. I had no idea that anyone else ever had done that. I didn't really understand any meditation at that point. And that was similar with the Enneagram, and somatics, that I felt these experiences. I had started to play with them, notice them in my body. And then all of a sudden, a system came along that was like, yes, there's that. And it's connected to that and that and that. And then somatics, yeah, your body does that. Here's another two things that you can do. And also notice that when you do that, notice your lower back as well. So I think it's been interesting. Like, it's just kind of how it's worked out that I've noticed something in my body or in my story, and then language or systems have come along or have always been there. And
Yeah.
I stumbled upon somehow.
Right. Yeah. One of my teachers, Marianne Gilbert, talks about the 1-4-7 triad as all pertaining to flow and kind of either allowing the flow or restricting the flow. And as you're describing how you've had these experiences and then allowed the flow, it's like all the information you need drops in. Your mind didn't have to go on an intensive research project. It was just the curiosity and the openness allowed this flow to just continue. So you're not in the way of it so much.
Yeah, when you use the language of like, when did you say yes, right? Like that kind of language saying yes, it seems so simplistic, and yet that's been my experience is saying yes to curiosity. Or one of my like kind of go-to lines in my brain now is everything's an experiment. And that
Yes.
has been a massive opening for me because that has not been my trained default. My trained default is good, bad, right, wrong, in, out, right? Like if I'm going to do a project, I'll share this story. A few years ago, and this probably was ongoing through most of my life, but it came to a head a few years ago. I'm sitting in my living room and I have my whiteboard. I love whiteboards, side note. So I have many whiteboards in my house. But I had my whiteboard out and I was planning. I was making this big business plan and it was going to be brilliant and awesome. And I had done all these kind of planning, organizing things, right? And I had this moment when I got to the end of it and I looked at it and I went, I don't actually have the skills to do this, number one. And number two, I think this is just a stalling tactic to getting started with anything. And that was a big moment for me of realizing that there's this default in me to make the perfect thing. And historically in my life, that has required so much upfront planning that I never get to execution. And therefore, it turns to me starting to feel like, do I ever follow through? Do I ever get done with things? If I talk to friends, they will all be like, yeah, Andy, you always follow through. But inwardly, I have that question of, well, I've done enough whiteboarding now that I really feel like I should have something to show for it, and I don't. And so that's been a softening for me as well, is, you can do something that's imperfect. Chill.
Yeah.
It can be an
Well,
experiment.
it almost can be there's an addiction to the efforting or the thinking, well, I'll just become so disciplined and that will lead to the thing. But it's almost like it's like the oh gosh, my metaphor is going to not make sense. But like on a wheel,
Hamsters on a wheel?
more like bikes or like it's just like not, it's
Yeah.
spinning, but it's not actually moving things forward.
Yeah.
But it feels like there's a lot of work being done because the engine's revving and, you've got a lot of energy toward it, and yet it's not actually engaging.
Yeah, and it's getting off I'm gonna go with the word stationary bike. Getting off that stationary bike of, like, mental gymnastics was a big is consistently a practice, and so it's constantly a friend recently asked me, like, "Does all of the inner work just come down to awareness?" And in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. But I think for me, a lot of it is hinging on how aware am I to the internal workings of who I am and to how I'm showing up in my community. And so that stationary bike, it takes a lot for me to realize and be aware of, oh, you've been cycling for 3 weeks on this idea. It's time to step off and re enter community or just step off and like go sweep the floor. Go do something that has a tangible right now effect and yet something that doesn't feel big enough because there's something beautiful in the mundane.
Oof. Yeah. And I want to ask more about your relationship with community because I know it's a big thing for you. And it sounds like it's part of what helps you get out of that because we can be internal without being aware, right? We can
Mhm.
get self-focused and hyper vigilant about things going on inside. So, yeah, talk to me about community and the role it's played in you being able to leverage what's going on inside to help you move into spaces that makes transformation really possible and felt outside of just the personal.
I'll share I'll share a story or an analogy that has always stuck with me, and it's kind of how I internally process this. Thomas Merton, who was a monk, has this imagery he shares. He shares that everyone has a spring and a stream within them. And the spring is you can use a lot of different language, heart space, soul space. It's our true self. It's our contemplative space. When you're silent and you just let yourself dance to the essence of who you are, that's your spring. And when it's healthy, it's beautiful, it's bubbling. I think of like the hot springs at Yellowstone, except for like not the smells and like not the promise of like death if you fall in, but like just beautiful, these like crystal blue, this part of you, and it's always in you. And then he says we've got streams, and the streams that lead out of that spring, that's our action. That's how we show up in the world. It's how we show up in our communities. And if we aren't focusing on the streams, what will end up happening is that the spring has nowhere to go, has no more outlets. So if we're not doing anything, if we're not engaging our world, and we just got this spring, you can do all the meditation you want. You can do all the inner work you want. And what's going to inevitably happen is that spring is going to become stagnant. That spring isn't going to have any outlet. It's going to become stagnant. You need the outflow. And on the other side, if all you're doing is focusing on the actions, I used to work on a political campaign in Seattle, and every activist was talking about burnout as if it was just like, yeah, this is what happens. We burn out. And it's because focusing only on the actions, on the streams. And Merton says, if you're only focusing on the streams, well, the same thing happens. Eventually that spring is going to malfunction because you're not giving it enough care. And so when I think about my experience of community, I think about where are the spaces that my inner life naturally flows into in a gentle and soft way and excitable, right? That bubbling in me. How can that inner life bubble into community? And how does my engagement in that community help foster the inner life within me? That's something that was really hard for me when I was working more in the political realm, the overtly like electoral politics, is that it didn't feel like there was space for my inner life, my spring to really get fed. And so I was just going, and I was burning out too. It took a lot for me to realize that part of that was that my inner spirituality, my sense of self, my sense of my inherent dignity was disconnected from what I was being asked to do on the
Mm,
election trail.
yeah.
And I don't think I've ever fully recovered from that realization. It's been a slow stepping back into like formal politics. I don't have any plans to like jump back in and go door knocking anytime soon, which used to be like one of my favorite things to do. But now I see, your question about community. Now I see my role and how does my inner life show up in the ways I work within my personal sphere of influence, my family, my partner, my kids. How does it show up when I'm in my communal sphere of influence? So my workplace, or I sit on a board for an organization at University of Washington. Like, how do I walk into those spaces in a gentle and listening and kind and humble way? And then there's the societal sphere, which is, I might not be door knocking next week. And everything that's at our societal level is impacting our personal and our communal. So how am I ensuring that we're talking about white supremacy within my family and at my workplace or on the board? Like, how are we talking about prisons and policing and like all these things? So I think for me, that's a big part of it, is reassessing what does it mean to authentically allow my inner life to show up in these spaces.
Oh, I'm just like, I'm mentally taking notes because when you said you haven't ever fully recovered maybe from the direct engagement in the political sphere that was so exhausting to your inner resources. I was in the nonprofit world in a similar space where the impact was so important, and it was important to everybody there, and yet it was so exhausting because there weren't the resources to replenish ourselves. And I was doing work on the inner life with people. So that did feed me to a degree. And yet it's still this process of coming back into, I hear all the things that you're saying, and not to put you on a pedestal, right? But it's like, oh, wow, there is such a natural flow of how you can just be with what's arising within you and engaged in the world without getting totally overwhelmed. And I'm just feeling my system being like, oh, it's still, that sounds like a lot. And recognizing the need to really return to ourselves, which I think is why I'm so drawn to the Enneagram, is this really direct path back home to ourselves with the hope, with the intention that that's going to return to the collective and that's going to be this unblocked part of the larger streams that are going to keep feeding onto themselves and creating this new paradigm, this new way of being that happens from the inside out is kind of how I've
Yeah.
come to see it.
Yeah. No,
Yep.
that's so good. And I think that's the interplay is that, like, when we talk about transformation, um, personal transformation does not happen if collective transformation doesn't, right? And collective transformation doesn't happen if personal transformation doesn't. So there's this both and I think what's so important for folks who are engaging in the inner work, whether it's with Enneagram, language and tools and structure, or something else. I obviously have like very much moved towards the Enneagram as like a core framework for myself. But what's so important is that you can't do it alone, right? And I think on my worst days, when I am lowest in terms of energy, in terms of resources, just in terms of my curmudgeonly energy is full blast, it's because I've been trying to go it alone or trying to do without giving myself permission to go look at the water, right? Even if I'm still alone, going to the water or going to the trees or going to watch some birds reminds me that there is no such thing as actually being alone if we're part of this, like, family of things is what Mary Oliver referred to it as, right?
Yeah, and I think this is such an invitation that this one energy brings to all of us, which is this invitation to the sacred, to living life as sacred and seeing nature as sacred and being part of this flow that we're talking about. And I'm like, I feel it from you just as you're sharing these stories and talking about it, it's like this gift, right? And the gift and the invitation of saying, hey, what if we don't constrict the flow inwardly or outwardly? What if we let it replenish itself? What if we offer, the pushes when we have that energy and the rest to receive when we don't, and stay in relationship?
Yeah, and be okay that it's gonna feel weird and wonky and funky and new. I think that's a huge part of it too, is, like, part of saying yes to the flow and to your essence is also accepting there's a ridiculousness of being alive that is scary and great.
Yeah, and I think this really lends itself to that possibility and that energy of not being critical, but being questioning, but opening up to the unfolding, which is again being in flow. It's not restricting it. And it's just a sense from you of like groundedness as you open up toward the unknown. And I'm curious, for other ones out there who might struggle with that unpredictability or not knowing that it's going to be corrected or feeling like things are just so off and so irritating and so awful that unless I go into fourth gear and like do it all myself, like the world's going to end. What do you have to keep saying yes to maintain your understanding of this sacred flow?
Well, last night I got really angry, and for the first time in months and months and months, I found myself full body angry, and I, like, really hit down with my hand on the side of my bed 3 times. And I was amped. My energy was high, I was frustrated, I felt out of control. And so I think my word for folks, like, this is hard. And, like, for me, I just have to remember to breathe. Take a second, slow down, and breathe. I also think it's really important to not demonize your emotions and to demonize what you're experiencing, the vibe you're putting off, or your feelings, your body sensations. Like, it's okay when you're angry. What is that anger inviting you to? And what is the part of you that anger is attempting to protect? So what's that part of you that's underneath the anger that's inviting you to something?
Right. I think we so rarely get curious about anger. And even in the last few years, as people have been more okay with, like, well, anger is the fuel to make the systems better, there still can be this lack of curiosity of maybe this anger just needs to move through my hand and through the bed frame. And
Yeah.
that is the motion that I need versus it has to go towards spending the next 12 hours fighting for something that's a longer fight that involves a lot of people.
Yeah, and if you talk to activists who have been in the game for a long time, what has allowed for that to happen is that there is a recognition that it is a long fight, right? And it is a long experience. And so I think when we talk, especially that conversation around anger, and as a one, that's why I jump to anger immediately. So like that's the you talked about just the discomfort of the inner simmering of a one in so many ways. Um, but when we talk about anger as fuel, I think that's totally right. And when you jump to anger as fuel without asking what is the anger stemming from, sometimes you don't realize that you're burning dirty fuel.
Mm.
And so a big question for me, and that's why whenever I'm angry or whenever those muscles tense up, I always question what's underneath this? What's underneath this? Because if that pain is dirty, if I haven't like metabolized that, or if that anger is coming from a dirty space that hasn't been worked with, maybe I just need to go play racquetball for an
Mm.
hour. Like
Mhm.
maybe I don't need to make that phone call. But if that anger is coming from a space that has been processed, I know that my words come out clearer. I'm able to keep my focus. I don't want to say calm, but I can keep my focus. And so that anger is directed in a way that is, I also don't want to say productive, but it's not dehumanizing. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, you're describing, when we hear the word serenity, I think we equate it with calm, but actually the meaning of the virtue for the one is about knowing what's yours to do and what's not yours to
yeah,
do and acting in the middle of whatever may be going on with only and all of what is yours to do.
yeah. That's so okay. I have to share this because it fits so perfectly. And this is a phrase I use for myself. And the phrase is, it is what it is, and how can I be present with it in a loving way?
Mm.
And the reason that means so much to me is it's exactly what you just said. How can I look into the world or look at my emotion, look at this part of me and say, without judgment, just it is what it is. And what does it mean for me right now to be present with that in a loving way? And your anger can be part of that love if the anger is operating in a clean and healthy way. But I think that's just always been a phrase that's really helped me is how can I be present with this injustice, with the person who's experiencing this injustice? How can I be present in a loving way with them? Or when my anger spikes and I hit that bed 3 times last night, how can I be present with that part of me and the part that's under that part in a loving way?
Yeah, I think for one who's really stuck in their stuff, it sounds like resignation, and it sounds like giving up, but it's really acceptance, right? Being
Yeah.
present to it in a loving way is not about giving up on the potential for different outcomes. It's just about really being with what's here and what's activating you or us, as we're noticing this pattern. So it does come back to that self-awareness, but there's such active engagement around the awareness that is, again, I think an invitation from the one energy around how do I be with this fully and allow it to move me in the direction that is going to channel the deeper need that's underneath.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. That's it.
That's amazing. I love it. I mean, there's just the other words, like integrity here comes to mind. And
Yeah.
it sounds like that. And when I'm aware of the whole system of what's flowing through me and where it's some old gunk that needs to be revisited and where it's really a vision for something that could be, then I get to let it flow. Right. I mean, I just love this word. Like
Yeah.
how nice it feels. And I hear from ones who are doing this work, like, oh, I can hang out in the gray a lot longer because I'm much more aware of the things that are happening around me and through me that doesn't need to be addressed right this second.
Yeah. A lot of the doing piece is like, I feel so trained in seeing the good and the bad, and my capacity for recognizing that good and bad are almost always doings that I'm noticing. That action is good, that action is bad, that thing that has been done is good, that thing that has been done is bad. And the more capacity I have to see that and name, oh, those are actions, those are doings, and then also build capacity for how can I be, right, in that space. I think the building of the capacity to just be and settle your central nervous system, settle your experience of what's happening to see the whole picture, right? It begins to gray space is a great way of saying it. For me, I don't think about it as gray space or gray area being in that space. I think about it as you have more capacity to see everything that's going on and just say, okay, here we are. Now, what's this next piece for how my energy is going to interplay with the energy of what is?
Another thing that's popping for me is that it's really this heart space that doesn't have as much of a timeline, that doesn't have so much beginning and ending. And it strikes me that you've been doing so much grief work because I think so much of what doesn't get touched on when this structure is running the show is that more fluid heart space or this despair that might come, this helplessness
Mm.
around all the feelings that might come if I'm just being and I'm meeting what's here. There's that urgency to get out of it.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that you're somebody who sits with that because I think that's what brings so much of the depth to connect all three centers, to be curious, to have our sense in our body of what is going on and what might need to change, but also to have this compassionate heart to both look at the moment of what is in that loving way, and then also to see the people behind the actions, including ourselves, that there is actually space for us to hold that, and it is going to ebb and flow in the way that the heart does its thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about teaching. And we all know this. We all have an experience of the person who is going so constantly. And even if what they're doing is amazing and helpful and brilliant, best teacher you've ever had, um, I think a lot of us have an experience of knowing a person like that and also knowing at the same time that they have not looked inward ever. And so you can organize the best charity drive. You can create a thrift store that does so many amazing things for the community. Um, and yet there's been little inner work. And I used the word curmudgeon earlier. I'm rethinking it right now in the context of this conversation, but I usually talk about a curmudgeon as it's the energy of a person who isn't in touch with their inner life. A curmudgeon, we all have an image for someone in our life who's got some curmudgeonly energy, but it's a person who, hasn't inquired inwardly, and so they project out or they blow their trauma through other people's bodies. And I think as a one, I am very in attune with when my curmudgeonly energy pops up because, and I'm just putting this kind of together as we talk, but I know that when my curmudgeonly energy is going out, the energy and the faces I get back at me tell me that something not quote unquote good is happening right now. Right. And that's also a flag for me of like, oh, if other people are looking at me like nothing good is currently being experienced, what what in me do I need to take a look at?
Yeah, I'm like, you took a dump in your outflow water, and now it's, like,
Yeah.
spreading everywhere. It's
Yep.
like,
Yep.
it's what you get back. I mean, just again, going to that self-awareness, I think that even being able to notice, "Oh, I think some of that's coming from me, and I can stop and look at this," is something so few people do, like you said. So if they're just pushing, doing these wonderful behaviors without looking inward, it can be really easy to say, well, people just don't appreciate it, or
Yeah.
I'm not getting this back. We get into the world is happening to me kind of irritation, curmudgeonliness of like, well, if things were just different, if other people were different. And so to have that awareness to be like, oh, I'm noticing these responses and they actually have something to tell me
Mhm.
about what I'm putting out there. That's deep work.
I think that's the deep work of processing who you are and doing so with soft eyes. Doing so with soft eyes. And knowing that there's gonna be some stuff that pops up that hurts. Knowing to find the people that allow you to stay in that space a little bit longer, a little bit more today than yesterday, and to do that in a way that's safe enough for you. And that's where I frequently come back to community. Having your circle of trust that you can be with, or having a good therapist to hold that space for you is vital.
Beautiful. I'm loving the gentleness, the little softness that you're bringing into all of this. And as we're kind of getting toward the end of our time together, I'm curious, what you see the Enneagram inviting you into now, currently at this stage.
I will name, I am probably the most stressed currently that I have ever been as an adult for lots of mostly personal things that are just going along in my family right now. And and so where the Enneagram has been helpful, and I think the invitation very much it's almost like, am I going to practice what I preach a little bit? Um, and I feel like I have been, so it's actually like an invitation of like a little bit more. Like, okay, things are getting a little bit more intense. The fire's getting a little bit hotter. And that's an invitation for me, I think, not to try to withstand the fire alone, but to really reach out to my resources. I went to a wedding this last weekend, and I cannot name just how much it was beautiful to be there. Geographically, to be out of the space, right, physically, where so much chaos is happening, and to be able to just like not be in it for a little bit. But I think the invitation is to really find the resources and the people in my life who mirror back to me the essence of who I am. I think that's what it is. That's the invitation for me right now, because it's getting harder and harder, I think, each day for me to attach to that and to hold that part of me by myself. And just in the day to day, even with my partner, even with my amazing kids, there's resources I needed to reach out to a little bit more. And
Yeah.
that's historically been hard to me. So
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for naming that. I think naming it is so much of the process of taking some of its power away,
mhm.
of saying, oh, this is my next step, or this is the invitation, and here's what I see going on. And there are resources. And I think one of the many beautiful things about the Enneagram is that it will actually point you in the direction of some of the resources that you might not always look for.
Totally. And that's been historically, that's been a huge part of the Enneagram for me, is that it has told me, like, when I look at this framework and I sense what's going on in my body and how I'm just kind of the vibe I'm feeling of the week or of the month, it's given me a direction of like, oh yeah, you need some silence right now. Like that's what you need. Your if your body, if your shoulders are going haywire on you and just, tight, 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 it's time to reconnect with your gut center, right? Reconnect with what your body needs and to sit with yourself for a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and just this conversation, like the insights that can come when we name the things, when we sit with the things, when we have the framework, but we also have that direct experience. And again, I
Mhm.
think that the framework is no good if we don't really include it in our direct experience. That's
Yeah.
the best way I know how to say it. But this, we can say, oh, body center, you do this, this, and this. But until you actually know what it's like, that tightness in your shoulders and the specific flavor, not of the pattern, but of it right now,
Yeah.
and then how to inquire and ask those questions and say, what are you needing? What are you protecting? And not having to fix it, really just asking and sitting with the questions, as Rilke tells us,
Yeah.
loving the questions. And I just see it as such a gift of yours that you're sharing. And I also want to honor and appreciate that, you're an amazing preacher of this, and to keep inviting yourself deeper into your own words is such a practice of humility, I think, for all teachers, that we don't actually have to have it all figured out. But if we're listening, and this is where that integrity comes in, when we're being in integrity with what we're able to offer for others and extend just a bit more compassion toward ourselves and toward our own struggles and our own flavor of where we keep getting stuck. Right? That's the work.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, thank you so much for sharing a bit about your experience about the invitations of the Enneagram. Where can people find out more about what you're up to?
Yeah, my website is probably the best place, andrewglang.com. You can also connect with me on Instagram, Andrew G. Lang. And then I have a newsletter that I send out every Wednesday where I just share like one quick teaching, two questions, and three resources. And that honestly, that comes from a lot of my Enneagram work of just like, what's the one part of myself that I can sit with for a week? What's the one part of my structure? What's the one part of who I am? So that's where people can find me and see what I'm doing in the world.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with me, with us. And I just want to appreciate the ability to distill through one story, one metaphor, one line, these things that we actually, I know I could use a lot more stillness around each question instead of trying to find all of them and getting overloaded. So again, thank you.
This is so good. Thank you.
So I hope you're more in touch with some of your own sacred flow and noticing what's going on inside your body and within your relationships, how that plays out. I would love for you to join the conversation over on Substack. There are some reflection questions. I'm so curious what this conversation has prompted in you and would love to hear from you. I hope that you grab Andrew's Gentle Change Starter Kit. It really is so important that we do engage in ways that work for us so we're not burning out and we're also not turning away from what the world needs from your contributions, your inner life, having that flow through communities and connections and making the changes that our world needs. So that's in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. We are going to be leaving the body center and headed to the heart center. There might be a special episode in between. You're going to have to come back to find out. So make sure you subscribe. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back with you soon. Thanks for listening to Enneagram Invitations. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share with a friend. And if you haven't yet, subscribe on Substack to get new episodes and show notes straight to your inbox. And you can join the conversation in the comments over there. That's karenburley.substack.com/podcast. Want to go even deeper? Paid subscribers are invited to intimate discussion spaces facilitated by me, where we keep exploring these invitations together. If you're in the process of saying yes to your own transformation, I'd love to see you there.